One of the most dramatic events in American military history took place in southern Montana on June 25th, 1876. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, commonly referred to as Custer's Last Stand, United States Army troops, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, clashed with the combined forces of Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribe warriors in the Valley of the Little Bighorn. The result was a decisive victory for the Sioux and their allies. Custer and his troops were massacred. This battle would be commemorated as the most dramatic event of the Great Sioux War of 1876 and would become a significant turning point in the conflict. So, what led to the events on that fateful day? And how would the effects of this battle dictate the future of the great native tribes of the Great Plains of North America? To understand the events that led to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or the Battle of the Greasy Grass, as the Lakota people called it, it is important to acknowledge the westward expansion of American settlers in the late 19th century. As pioneers and American settlers slowly crept westward across the American frontier, the United States government forced the native tribes of these lands to sign treaties that forced their people onto reservations, making way for the expansion of white settlements and the construction of the nation's quickly expanding railroad network. One of these treaties was the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, which set the boundaries of the Great Sioux Reservation, encompassing territory in parts of modern day Montana, Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Included in this territory was the Black Hills of South Dakota, a majestic and imposing mountain range considered sacred by the Plains Indian tribes. No whites were permitted anywhere within this reservation. In 1874, the U.S. government sent George Custer on an expedition to examine the Black Hills. On this expedition, Custer and his men discovered gold, and everything changed. Prospectors from across the country flooded into these sacred lands, openly defying the terms of the treaty. The federal government was powerless to stop them. As a result of the encroachment of white settlers, Cheyenne and Lakota began moving westward onto the lands of smaller tribes, including the Crow, their sworn enemies. Meanwhile, the Grant administration debated how to handle the Black Hills issue. Eventually, a consensus was reached to let white settlers and prospectors continue to encroach on the Black Hills. And as for the Indians who tried to resist, Indian Inspector Irwin C. Watkins suggested to send troops against them in the winter, the sooner the better, and whip them into subjection. Thus began the Great Sioux War of 1876. Custer was given command of the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army. A veteran of the Civil War, Custer was a young, flamboyant military commander, eager to make a name for himself through a decisive victory over the Sioux and cement his legacy in American military history. Custer's ambition and impulsiveness would prove to be fatal flaws that helped to seal his fate in the coming conflict. In the midsummer of 1876, the Lakota spiritual leader, Sitting Bull, experienced a vision in which he saw a great military victory for his people. This prophetic vision told him that blue coated soldiers would fall into camp like grasshoppers from the sky. In the early morning of June 25th, a group of Crow Scouts under Custer's command spotted signs of a large encampment of the Sioux and their allies near the banks of the Little Bighorn River. Worried that his scouts had been spotted by the villagers in the encampment, Custer ordered a surprise attack that same morning, hoping that a multi-pronged attack would overwhelm the villagers and force them to scatter and ultimately surrender. Custer split his men into 3 groups, one led by Major Marcus Reno, the other by Captain Frederick Benteen, and the final group by Custer himself. Sitting Bull and the Sioux's greatest warrior, Crazy Horse, were expecting the attack and closely observed Custer's advance. Filled with courage from Sitting Bull's vision and inspired by the leadership of Crazy Horse, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors awaited Custer's men well armed and well prepared. Sioux War Chief Two Moon recounted preparing for the battle and calling to his people, "I am Two Moon, your chief. Don't run away. Stay here and fight. You must stay and fight the white soldiers. I shall stay, even if I am too to be killed. Major Reno first attacked the encampment from the south across the Little Bighorn River and quickly sustained heavy losses. Custer then made the hasty decision to attack the main encampment with his group alone, numbering approximately 200 men. They were met with a fierce and overwhelming resistance. Many of the Sioux warriors and their allies were armed with modern rifles, and nearly all were seasoned horseback warriors. The U.S. forces were quickly overwhelmed. By the following morning, June 26th, Custer and nearly all the men under his command were annihilated. The battle would live on in the memory of the native warriors that fought it, for both its glory and its brutality. Black Elk, a Sioux visionary and healer, participated in the battle at the age of 12. Following the Sioux victory, he would recount, "I was not sorry at all. I was a happy boy. Those Wasichus had come to kill our mothers and fathers and us, and it was our country." One Lakota chief, Red Horse, would later say, "I don't like to talk about that fight. If I hear any of my people talking about it, I always move away." For the United States, the battle was a devastating defeat. 2 days after the battle, General Alfred H. Terry, Custer's commanding officer, would report in a telegram to Army headquarters in Washington, D.C., the following: "Of the movements of General Custer and the 5 companies under his immediate command, scarcely anything is known, for no officer or soldier who accompanied him has yet been found alive." The Sioux, euphoric from their victory, saw Custer's defeat as a sign of the eventual liberation of their people from the oppression of the white man. This optimism, however, was short lived. The U.S. Army, enraged by Custer's defeat, launched a series of aggressive and devastating campaigns to subdue the Sioux and their allies, ultimately bringing an end to the Great Sioux War of 1876. The Sioux were forced onto even smaller reservations, their sacred lands confiscated and desecrated. Crazy Horse would eventually surrender to U.S. forces in 1877 and would be killed under mysterious circumstances while imprisoned at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Sitting Bull fled to Canada shortly after the battle, before returning to the United States in 1881 to also surrender. In 1890, Sitting Bull was arrested and killed by tribal police in South Dakota. Custer's last stand lives on in the American imagination, for its symbolism and for its tragedy. To some, Custer was a hero who paid the ultimate sacrifice while outmanned and outgunned by superior forces, joining the ranks of mythic heroes such as Davy Crockett at the Alamo. For others, the Battle of the Greasy Grass was the last gasp of victory of a subjugated people defending their lands and way of life from the devouring forces of American colonialism. Brave gatekeepers that did all they could to prevent the final closing of the American frontier and the end of the American West.